Harry's wife. Her tears flood Montecito. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Many of you are aware that areas of Southern California have recently been hit by flooding. California is not something that's ordinarily associated, of course, with flooding, known as a particularly dry place, where usually the greenery fades to that of brownery, unless, of course, you're Harry and Harry's wife, whereby your gardens are kept lush and verdant as a consequence of raiding the sacred underground springs. However, just recently, Montecito has been hit by the flash flooding, almost 5 years to the day when there was a mudslide which caused loss of life. Have a look at this piece of footage coming up next.
This is Montecito, right at ground zero, 5 years ago. That terrible mudslide that killed 23 people. The whole town's being evacuated.
Now, you might ask yourself, what was I looking at there? Well, at first you possibly might have thought, is this sort of brown watery stuff basically the verbal diarrhea that Harry's wife issues on a near daily basis? You might have thought that, but she has been rather quiet recently, as she's been allowing Harry to hang himself through his various disclosures about his frostbitten penis and rubbing cream into his knob whilst thinking about his mother, amongst many other own goals. Therefore, you might have thought, maybe it's the effluent that Harry has been issuing forth as a consequence of what is written in Spare. But no, those are the floodwaters cascading through Montecito. And this then raises the question of where has this come from? And I'm, of course, able to exclusively explain to you that the flooding has been caused by Harry's wife's tears, because recent research has demonstrated that the lady who can cry on demand, one tear, left eye, go, cries so often and with such force that it always causes her to collapse to the floor. It's a little-known phenomenon, but the cries of the righteous and the tears of the woke cause an immediate loss of strength in the legs, which causes the crier to fall to the floor. And such is the volume of tears that she cries, crying for the world, crying for its ills, crying for wanting the world to be a better place, crying for reconciliation, wherever that might be in the world. Gallons upon gallons of tears issue forth. And what starts off as a little trickle becomes a rivulet, becomes a stream, becomes a river, and before we know it, there is a raging, frothing torrent of tears, salty tears streaming out of the 27,000 flushing toileted mansion, until we see the devastation and flooding that has been caused in Montecito. But leaving aside the humorous observation about the fact that it's her tears that have caused the flooding in Montecito, there is a serious point to this. This is a woman who holds herself out as being strong, as independent, as a feminist. Now, that's not to say that somebody who is a feminist isn't allowed to cry, far from it, but you would have thought that she would recognise that crying a lot is somewhat contrary to those adjectives that she likes to use to describe herself. Furthermore, it's not like she's a wet behind the ears 16-year-old, she's in her 40s, and therefore one might say somewhat battle-hardened to life. Furthermore, given the fact that she has faced numerous rejections and apparently has had a successful, in inverted commas, career in what is ostensibly a tough career, in terms of being commented on your appearance, being rejected, told you're not good enough, i.e. acting, you'd have thought, therefore, that the ability to issue all of these torrents of tears, and, of course, always collapsing to the ground as a consequence of it, would have been lost. Furthermore, She's repeatedly telling us how happy she is, how delighted she is, that she's forging her own path, that she's, to use that awful phrase, living her best life. Also, this is a woman that believes that she can cut it as a politician, that she can sharpen her elbows and get in amongst the viper's nest in order to become a successful politician, whether that's congresswoman, senator, or even, at the height of delusion, believing that she could become president of the United States. So, given that we've got such a strong independent feminist who has dealt with so many rejections within her career, has dealt with all of the hard-bitten aspects of that career, is apparently radiantly happy and able to tackle a political career, how come she cries so much? She cried in Africa. Nobody asked me if I was okay. Blub, 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 blub. She cried purportedly after the miscarriage. Harry found her crying when she was breastfeeding Archie. She cried with the two-handed wipe in the Netflix docu-shit. Catherine made her cry. She's repeatedly collapsed to the floor crying. Yet, in her podcast, she claimed it was hard for her to cry. So, which is it? What we have here is an individual that is regularly reported on as having cried, yet claims that she's not the type of person that finds it easy to cry, and invariably describes herself as someone who wouldn't be seen as somebody who cries. So, what is it? Well, as you know, because she's a narcissist, she can be all of those things. Owing to compartmentalization, she can be a strong independent feminist now, and in half an hour, she can collapse to the floor crying her eyes out, and that's okay. She doesn't see that as contradictory. She can say in a podcast, I find it really difficult to cry, and then the following day, be collapsed in a blubbering heap for Harry to find her. That's okay. And her narcissism prevents her from seeing that she maintains contradictory stances with regard to 1 minute saying that she's all of these things which suggest that she's not somebody that cries, and then repeatedly reports herself as crying. It's her narcissism. Remember, her narcissism pursues subconsciously control, fuel, character traits and residual benefits, and it doesn't care how she does it. It doesn't care how she goes after that. It doesn't care the manner by which she does it, as long as she gets it. Of course, it has to have regard to maintaining a facade, because she's a mid-range narcissist. But the point is, her narcissism doesn't care if she asserts control over somebody by saying, listen to me, future leaders of America, I am a strong independent feminist. And then 30 minutes later, boo-hoo-hoo, blub, 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 blub. It doesn't matter if her narcissism says, I'm pretty tough. I've dealt with lots of rejections. I know what it's like in the biz. And then 15 minutes later be found collapsed to the floor crying her eyes out as a consequence of a fractured eyelash. Her narcissism doesn't care. And through compartmentalization, it prevents her from seeing that this is contradictory. There's more to it than that, though. Notice how often Harry finds her collapsed to the floor crying. Isn't that oh so convenient? It's not a case that he wanders in and thinks about cracking one off and reaches for the Elizabeth Arden cream and puts his hand on the pillow and goes, but why? The pillow is damp. Has my fair and noble wife been crying here? I better go and ask her. No. Whenever he walks in, she just happens to be on the floor and she's crying. It's almost as if, as soon as she hears him walking along the corridor or his keys in the door, it's quick, get myself onto the floor, left eye, one eye, left eye, whatever it is, one tear, cry, off we go. Or turn on the full waterworks. And that is actually what is happening. How do I know? Because of her narcissism. She never sits crying alone. Why? It's pointless. There's no audience. A narcissist sat crying alone, it's a waste of time and energy. Instead, her narcissism would cause her to ring somebody up to cry, and thus they would hear the pity play, and they go, oh, what's the matter? Crying lady of Montecito. Blub, blub, blub. British press are horrible. Blub, blub, blub. King Charles won't give my children titles. Blub, blub, blub. Harry ran off with the chicken of authenticity, whatever it might be, but because she's got an audience, that audience has to be controlled and can give her fuel, and her narcissism, because she's a crybaby at times, chooses the pity play. She does not just happen to be crying and Harry walks in. Her narcissism knows he's on the radar, and therefore subconsciously it says this: the intimate partner primary source is about to appear. Is he under control? We have no information about whether he's under control, therefore he's assumed not to be under control. First law of narcissism applies. All appliances must be brought under control and kept under control at all times. Therefore, we must get him under control. Today we will select a pity play. Therefore, we make our narcissist, Harry's wife, believe that she's upset about something and cause her to perhaps squeeze out a few tears and to throw herself on the floor, because remember, with her, everything's overly dramatic, melodramatic and stylized. She can't just be sat there quietly sobbing. It's got to be your sort of Mills and Boon, throwing herself onto the floor, lots of tears, the heaving and racking sobs of her misery. And thus, the White Knight walks in, or the Ginger Knight. What makes you? What is it? Harry! And thus a tale of woe is issued forth along with the accompanying tears. Harry, of course, being such a dimwit, doesn't think to himself, isn't it strange how I'm always walking in on her when she's crying? That she doesn't start crying part way through, or I wander in just as she's finished. If Harry had his brains about him and decided to spy upon her, he would never, ever see her just sat there on her own crying. Why? Because the narcissism dictates that's pointless. There's nobody there to control. Therefore, it won't make her cry on her own. She doesn't feel sorry for herself in such situations because the narcissism will not let her feel sorry for herself in such a situation. It will only allow her to feel sorry for herself if there's something to be gained. Namely, there's a television camera watching, or Harry is walked in, or there's another person that she's talking to, an interviewer, where she's saying, nobody asked me if I was okay. It's all manufactured by her narcissism. Of course, she believes she's upset because the narcissism has to make her believe that she's upset in order to cause her to appear at least authentic in her tears. But it's all done by her narcissism, and it's part of a manipulation by way of a pity play. So those of you who have been thinking about her and are crying and have noticed these incongruous situations between putting forward an appearance which suggests that she's not one to cry, but then she does lots of it. You know why that contradiction exists. It's a compartmentalization. And also to understand that it's manufactured by her narcissism to cause her to cry, to assert control over people, notably Harry. And because of the way that her narcissism functions, we get this Mills and Boon stylized dramatic version, which includes the falling to the floor, the collapsing to the floor each time. And that's the explanation behind why Harry's wife cries as she does. I'm H.G. Tudor. Make sure you share this video far and wide. Thank you for listening.